Hi everyone, this is For the Love of Comics, wishing all of you a very happy new year in this, our first video of 2023. And in this episode, I am going to talk about 10 comics. I didn't set out to list 10 comics, that's just the way it ended up. I'm going to talk about 10 comics as a way of looking back at 2022. But of course, first, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I came to pick these 10 comics, because this isn't a 10 best comics of 2022. It's not even the 10 best comics that I read or my favorite 10 comics of the year, although they could be very easily the 10 best comics I read or my 10 favorite comics of the year. I wouldn't contest that. But the reason they're on the list today is because they're the most memorable reads for me of 2022. When I look back at the year that was, these are the comics that I remember reading. And let's get this out of the way. 2022 was a terrible, tough year for me personally. It was tinged with the illness and the passing of near and dear ones and the emotional and mental processing that grief has. Very distantly on the work front, there were challenges, ones that were dealt with, but again, requiring a lot of mental, emotional, analytical involvement. Why am I talking about these things in a video of 10 comics? Because I think most of us will agree that what we appreciate is as much a function of who we are at the time that we're reading it or watching it, consuming it in any way. Who we are at that point of time is a significant part of how we react to something and how something echoes with us. And because I'm going to be talking about 10 books that echoed with me, I think it's natural to try and identify the other factors also beyond just the work that might be playing a part in determining how these things resonate. Now, I know that many people, including myself in the past, have often looked upon some types of reading as a solace or as a refuge from other things, a form of escapism. But interestingly, looking at these 10 books, that doesn't seem to be the case with me, at least this year. These books are not comfort reading. In fact, a couple of them are outright and purposefully discomforting. And none of these books, I think, would classify as escapist work, at least in the way that people usually mean it. Rather, I found these books to often directly or indirectly address the things that I was dealing with outside, dealing with the world, dealing with family, dealing with work and economy, and created this larger sense of a world in which people have so much in common, no matter what time period we're talking about or what geography we're talking about. There are a fair number of non-fiction works on this list, as well as some fiction that is very heavily based in non-fiction, but there are also undoubtedly genre works. So I'm not really talking about surface realism. I think the works that we read are not only translated by us as who we are at that time, but also work on making us who we are at that time. So for me, they're not just things I pick because I want to feel a particular way. Who I am at that time becomes transformed, at least contributed to, by what I'm reading. So not only do the usual caveats apply, that this is a personal list, it's not necessarily books that were published in 2022, but books that I read in 2022. But for me, there is an additional level of personalization over here. There are other books that I loved reading, and I'll probably talk about them in upcoming videos. But because these are the first books that came to mind, and I can so distinctly identify the particular things that continue to echo with me, this is as much a list of books that helped me in my conversations with myself, books that made me who I was this year, as it is the books I really enjoyed. I'll go through this list semi-chronologically. I'll start chronologically and end chronologically, which means I'll start with the first couple of books I read in the year, 2022, and end with the last couple of books. In the middle, I'm going to jump all around based purely on what connects these books in my mind. So that's a lot of ado. I hope it's about something. Without any further ado, let's jump into my list of my most memorable comics reads of 2022. Looking over the list of books that I have over here, I can see that there are some books that I have talked about in the last year on my channel or other people's channels here on YouTube. And then there are books that I haven't. So as I go through this list, I'm also going to try to divide that up, maybe spend a little less time, famous last words, maybe spend a little less time on the ones I've already talked about and instead direct you to those videos, and maybe give a little bit more time to the ones that I've not mentioned yet. Although I do want to make deeper dives on some of them, so maybe I'll spend less time on them over here and direct you to a future video. So I'm not really sure what I decided. The year began with 2 reads, which were me catching up on the previous year's reads. So these are both books that were published in 2021 that I fully intended to read as soon as I heard about them. And I think it was January of 22 when I got to read both of them. Interestingly, they also represent 2 very different ways that I get to read new comics. The first of these was Rain Like Hammers, written and drawn by Brandon Graham. I talked about this in my top 10 image comics video, which was a live stream, and I talked about a whole bunch of Brandon Graham comics. In fact, I think I said Brandon Graham to me epitomizes image comics because of the associations I have with this kind of storytelling being so formed by his unique bubblegum cyberpunk comics. This is a full story collecting all the issues into one trade paperback, a complete standalone story unrelated to anything else, which I think is the case for everything on this list. I should mention that everything over here is a standalone read. And I'm a big fan of King City and Multiple Warheads, which this book is quite reminiscent of, as well as Brandon Graham's work on the Prophet comics. Whether or not you've read those comics, this is an excellent sci-fi, dystopian, absolutely alien, yet strangely affecting world. I'll direct you to my top 10 image comics for more on this, but apart from it being an excellent comic, the reason this resonated with me at the end of the year, not just because it was the first comic of the year, was because I found this comic through recommendations of other YouTubers and commenters on YouTube. In spite of being a fan of Brandon Graham's, I was not aware of this comic until it was highlighted and spotlighted, and not just highlighted and spotlighted, but as one of the best reads of the year by people like Earl Grey and Sleepy Reader, Comic Crack, La Raza. There and others' discussions around this comic really shot it up in my list of to read books. And so this book represents to me all those comics that I find because of people out there, people commenting, people writing to me, people sending me chat messages, but also people who make videos and spotlight for me books, people whose tastes I have come to trust, whether they're old horses like the ones I mentioned or newer channels. So here I'm thinking about Off My Shelves and Highland G and the Comic Board, with whom I've been on many live streams, and even channels like Analog Comics, who's just starting out but has already spotlighted for me many European comics. This is an aspect of the quote-unquote community that I've really understood fully over the last couple of years, and particularly in 2022. That discussion around not just objects and the hobby of collecting, which we all love, but the act of reading itself and the generosity in sharing with each other what our thoughts are. Rain Like Hammers is a gem that I'm glad to jump on to the bandwagon for, in part because of what a fantastic bandwagon it is. The next book on my list, which I also read in January of 2022, was a book that I have talked about on YouTube, but not on my channel. At least I don't think on my channel. I was invited over to Highland G's channel along with a couple of other YouTubers to talk about some recent reads that we enjoyed, and it was there that I mentioned Factory Summers, written and drawn by Guy Delisle and published by Drawn and Quarterly. Just like with Brandon Graham, I am a big fan of Guy Delisle's, but this was something I was aware that was coming out and I was waiting to find available in India at a reasonable price. This is a memoir by writer-artist Guy Delisle, which itself is nothing remarkable. Most of his books are memoirs, usually about his travels. So there's Pyongyang, Shenzhen, Jerusalem, Burma Chronicles, as well as the one significant work of non-autobiography, Hostage. This, however, is not a memoir of his contemporary adult life, but a memoir of his childhood and of a summer job that he had for several years before he graduated high school. For people who are not familiar with Guy Delisle, I think this makes a wonderful introduction because you meet him as a young boy and get this coming-of-age story set in a world that not only doesn't exist anymore, but one that you can see the inevitable end of in the years chronicled here. And if you are a fan of Guy Delisle, I think this is sort of a revelatory book, a switch to something that we haven't seen before, something that marries the sort of receding innocence of youth with the wisdom as well as the nostalgia of the adult in a lovely balance that looks at not just growing up and work, but also environments and how they shape us. The theme of work and how it shapes us is actually a bit of a pattern in this list, but Factory Summers is a gentle, kind, but still clear-eyed read, unlike some of the more lacerating books we'll see later. A terrific addition to anyone's library, Guy Delisle's memories of his Factory Summers are now partially mine as well. Now, both Brandon Graham and Guy Delisle are old favorites of mine, and looking through my list, I can see that that's something that recurs. New reads from old favorites. And the next book on this list definitely falls into that category, but is a more recent favorite. I made a video called From Comic to Comic to Comic, 3 European comics that I enjoyed discovering, in which I talked about 2 comics by Amy de Jong, one written and drawn by her and one drawn by her but written by Zidru. And the third comic on this list is also my third Amy de Jong comic, Days of Sand, published by Self-Made Hero. This, I believe, is actually a 2022 publication, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it came out in Dutch and other European languages in 2021, but I think I'm getting this pretty close to when it was published, and this was a phenomenal, devastating read. Days of Sand is written and drawn by Amy de Jong, and I believe it's colored by her as well, although I'm not sure about that now. And unlike her previous books, which were set in contemporary Europe, this is a period piece set in the United States. More specifically, in the Dust Bowl during the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, the devastated farmlands of central and southern United States. It tells a story of a photographer who's sent out on a sort of photographic mission to document almost the misery and the suffering of these people, to put it in front of people who may not be aware, to get some sort of reaction around it. And this is one of those comics that probably needs a deep dive into it, maybe even paired with Factory Summers and another book that's coming up later. This is another book about work, but about the absence of work and the nature of this photographer's work, where he starts questioning what he's doing and what the point of it is. These questions are most obviously manifested by people who ask him, like, what good will he be able to do with this? What point is there to these photographs? What point is there to these news stories? Are they going to stop the dust from blowing? One character asks him. Like the other works by Amy de Jong that I had enjoyed so much, this mixes sentimentality with starkness in a way that just works for me. We're haunted not just by the plight of the people our central character meets, but we're also haunted by the questions that he is asked by others and by himself. And I think it's inescapable when reading such a story to extend the questions, to say, what's the point of this story? What's the point about writing about something that happened so long ago? What's the point about writing about suffering that could not be in any way helped by the publication of these stories and these books? And therefore, what's the point of us reading? But I also think that when you are moved by art, a work that has weight, meaning, or profundity for you, when you're moved by that, whether it's a comic or a movie or a photograph, you know what the point is. You understand it even if you're not able to articulate it, that these are things that we should bear witness to. These are things that we should understand. Not only because let's try and find a way that it never happens again, not only for prescriptive reasons, but for reasons of empathy, of trying to understand what exists in the world, to first and foremost acknowledge the human experience. Asking us to look at things closely, asking us to look at things a second time, these are the things that stories do so well. And that's really one of the main reasons this book resonated with me, is it asked and answered questions so beautifully and subtly, where I don't think it's trying to teach you a lesson, but I think it's possible to learn something anyway.